Welcome to Horrible Fates, where the most unexpected and tragic endings to seemingly ordinary lives are examined. We will take some time to explore the darkness that can lurk just beneath the surface of everyday existence. Welcome to The Cellar. Before I dive into this first story, I want to thank Ellen A., who sent me an email recommending I cover this tale. Thank you, Ellen. Now let's go ahead and dive into our first story. Giulia Manfrini was born in 1988 in the small town of Venaria Reale. Venaria Reale is located in the metropolitan city of Turin in the Italian region of Piedmont. It's around a 3-hour, 246-kilometer or 153-mile drive south of Geneva, Switzerland. Growing up, Giulia loved the outdoors. From the mountains to the oceans, she simply couldn't get enough. This love eventually led her to pursuing numerous different sports. She would take to skiing at a young age, but soon discovered that her passion belonged elsewhere. Giulia would begin snowboarding, and from the first moment she strapped on a board, she knew this was what she wanted to do for the rest of her life. Giulia would snowboard frequently, eventually turning her passion into a professional career. Giulia was a talented young woman, and she would begin making a name for herself in 2006-2007 when she scored a victory in the Italian Youth Cup. Giulia would continue to train and improve her skills. She would eventually travel to the University of Turin, where she would study law, and in 2013, she would graduate. Giulia would eventually take her talent and knowledge and become a snowboarding instructor. She enjoyed working and teaching those that shared the same passion she had for the sport. Sadly for Giulia, her professional snowboarding career would be derailed after she suffered an injury, but this didn't stop Giulia from pushing forward. Giulia would find her next passion far away from the snow-covered mountains. The waves and water were where her next adventure laid as she took to surfing with the same passion and love that she had brought to snowboarding. Just like snowboarding, Giulia would become extremely good at surfing. She would continue to excel, and she eventually acquired her teaching certification. As a teacher, Giulia would begin traveling the world. From my research, it's easy to say that Giulia lived an incredible life, traveling all across the globe. She would visit 45 different countries, and she took the time to learn 6 different languages. She would also settle down and live in 6 different countries on 4 different continents. I found a quote about Giulia that really summarized who she was. Giulia couldn't travel without people falling in love with her smile, laugh, and endless stoke. Anyone was lucky to have her on board a charter or surf trip. That now brings us to October 18th, 2024. Giulia was surfing in the waters near Ombak Bang Bang, near Masakut Island. This area is located off the coast of West Sumatra, Indonesia. Giulia was there catching waves and enjoying the sun and sea with some friends and fellow surfers. The day was going about as normal as one would expect. Giulia had done this so many times before. For her, it was as natural and as easy as breathing. She would soon grab her board, her toes feeling their way within the sand beneath her feet. She would begin her walk, soon wading out into the warm salt water, the sun shining with not a cloud in the sky overhead. Soon, Giulia would wade out far enough, feeling the waves carry her up and down underneath her board. As she began catching one of those beautiful waves, something completely unimaginable would occur. As Giulia was on her board, a fish would come careening out of the crystal clear waters before her. Now, I've seen it reported as a swordfish, and I've also seen it reported as a needlefish. Either way, both needlefish and swordfish have long, sharp bills and have the ability to jump out of the water. As this creature came at her unexpectedly, the nose of the fish would plunge straight into the left side of Giulia's chest, immediately knocking her from her board, sending her plunging backwards into the waters below. For those around Giulia, it immediately became apparent that she was in some sort of distress. Onlookers would hurry to her aid, rushing her to shore, where 2 people attempted to provide her with help. She was soon rushed to a local medical center where it was discovered that she had a 5-centimeter stab wound within her chest. Medical staff would do all they could for the young woman, but at only 36 years of age, Julia Manfrini would be pronounced dead. What her exact cause of death was has been speculated on. But one report stated that she had begun foaming from the nose during the ordeal, which according to reports suggests that she was oxygen deprived from drowning. Whatever the cause of the death was, what happened to Julia was the most freak of accidents. The chance of one of these fish jumping out of the water when they did and careening into her the way it did is just unbelievable. In the end, Julia died while doing what she loved more than anything in the world. Although she only lived to be 36, I think it's easy to say that Julia truly lived a vibrant and fulfilling life. I want to take a brief moment to send my deepest condolences to all of Julia's friends, family, and the many people she came into contact with over her brief time on this planet. Now, before we dive into story number 2, I just want to take a brief moment to say hi to everyone, thank you for watching, and if you enjoy what I do here, please consider taking a quick moment to hit that like button and leave a comment below. Also, please subscribe if you haven't already. It will help push this video out to more and more people just like each and every one of you. With that said, let's go ahead and dive into another story. Lunenburg County is a county nestled within the Commonwealth of Virginia. It is just southwest of Richmond, Virginia, and is around 96 miles north of Raleigh, North Carolina. Lunenburg is known for its strong agriculture. Its climate is suited to various crops, with tobacco being its principal cash crop for some time. A large portion of the Lunenburg area is made up of rolling hills and dense forests. This story takes us there on December 9th, 2024. Lester C. Harvey was a 58-year-old man from Phoenix, Virginia. Phoenix is around a 35-mile, 56-kilometer drive northwest from Lunenburg. Lester was a self-employed contractor who worked day in and day out to provide for his family. He was also an avid outdoorsman. It was December, and it was certainly a cold one, as Lester woke early. See, on this day, he and some friends of his were going hunting within the wilderness of Lunenburg County. Lester was an avid nature lover and lifelong hunter. He found himself truly at home within the quiet tranquility of the Virginia forests he frequented for such a large amount of his life. He had been hunting for decades at this point, and this morning felt like so many that had come before. Lester prepared his rifle and double-checked that his bags were packed with everything he would need for today's trip. He soon set off, hoping to reach the forest before the morning's first light. As he and his companions met up, the forest was quiet and still in the dim morning light. They soon set off, with nothing but the crunch of cold dead leaves sounding off under their boots. The men would continue traveling into the dense forest, listening for the sound of wildlife while keeping their eyes open for tracks. As the sun continued its upward trajectory, mid-morning would greet the men with their first potential prey. The men found themselves at Black Bear, and it was luckily still unaware of their presence. Lester and the other hunters would quietly give each other a glance, knowing that this was going to be their target. But before any of them could act, the bear picked up on the group being there, probably catching a whiff of the men in the cold morning breeze. The bear would take off, faster than any of the men, as black bears can reach a speed of up to 35 miles per hour or 56 kilometers per hour. Lester and his friends would give chase after the bear, rifles drawn and at the ready in case the animal decided to stop and hold its ground. Soon enough, the animal spotted a tree and made the decision to scale it in an effort to evade the intruders of his forest refuge. The men would eventually catch up with the bear, Lester stopping around 10 feet from where the animal was now perched in the tree. The men took a brief moment to catch their breath before Lester's friend took aim with his rifle. Within a couple of breaths, the crack of the rifle was heard echoing through the forest. His aim had been true, as the bullet plunged into the bear. The bear let out a cry before his body gave out. But what happened next, no one was prepared for. The animal's hulking black mass would fall from the tree. Even though Lester was standing around 10 feet from the base of this tree, it wasn't enough, and he did not realize it until it was too late. As the heavy animal came crashing down on top of Lester, pinning him under his powerful weight. Lester's friend quickly rushed to his aid, working to get the animal off of Lester. It was apparent that Lester was not doing well. Now it's unclear what Lester's injuries truly were, but one can suspect that there was potentially broken bones and internal bleeding. Now, I have seen some differing reports on what happened next, but what I know for certain is that Lester was helped out of the woods and he would eventually make it to a local hospital. Lester was as tough as they come, and he fought for his life bravely. But 4 days later, on December 13th, Lester's battle would come to an end as he succumbed to the numerous injuries he had suffered. Lester was 58 years old and left behind a wife, 5 children, and 8 grandchildren. Following the tragedy, Lester's son would write, "I love you, Dad. We had some great times. I am so thankful for all the memories we made and all you taught me. I wouldn't be the man I am now if it wasn't for you." One of Lester's daughters also wrote, "My dad was the hardest worker I know. He was either working or hunting. The only time he missed work was to hunt. I'm broken in ways I didn't even know I could break. Please, just pray for us." As always, I want to send my deepest condolences to all of Lester's friends and family. It was January 18th, 2015, in North Miami, Florida. North Miami is a suburban city that is located within the northeast of Miami-Dade County. It's about 10 miles or 16 kilometers north of Miami. 68-year-old Dennis Antiporek, along with his wife Ronnie, both resided at the Eden Isles condominium complex. This complex provided good living to the couple, as it had a private gym, private pool, and private sauna. Dennis was closing in on celebrating his 69th birthday. Around this time, he and his wife Ronnie were also closing in on their 50th wedding anniversary. The pair had been high school sweethearts, and their love had remained strong for decades up to this point. At around 11 p.m. that evening, Dennis made the decision to venture on down to the private sauna. This was something he had done numerous times, and he enjoyed spending some time within the heat. He would proceed to get himself ready, towel in hand. He then scribbled out a note onto the refrigerator, letting his wife know where he was heading off to. Dennis would then make his way to the doorway of the apartment, exit, and make his way down to the sauna. 3 hours would pass before Ronnie Antiporek awoke from a deep sleep. She immediately realized her husband was nowhere to be found. In a panic, she went and woke the pair's daughter, Laura. Laura would immediately hop out of bed, throwing on some clothes and then beginning the search for her father. They would first travel downstairs at the condo, checking Dennis's car to see if he had driven off anywhere, but they found his car resting in the same place it had been earlier in the day. They then traveled back to the condo and did a thorough search, but Dennis was simply nowhere to be found. That's when Laura had the idea of checking out the men's locker room, where the sauna is located. Her father often ventured down there, and they were hopeful that that's where he would be. They would soon arrive at the sauna door, and Laura would attempt to open it, but the door was scalding hot to the touch. It would take some further effort, but Laura would manage to pop the door open. The extreme heat radiated from within the room, smashing into Laura like an all-encompassing hot wet blanket, making it hard for her to catch her breath. The steam would slowly exit the room, and visibility would finally return. At the same time, the smell of cooked flesh was pungent within the air. It was like being inside a giant beef jerky dehydrator. As her eyes began to focus, a horrifying discovery was made. There, in the room, was a body on the floor. It was curled up in a fetal-like position. The skin was black and charred, like it had been left on a grill for far too long. Pieces of the cooked body were adhered to parts of the bench and the floor. It was an absolutely horrifying scene. As she examined the man, her first thought was, "Well, that's not my dad." She swiftly had to exit the room. The heat and smell was too much for her to bear. After leaving the room, she knew she would have to call 911, but before she did, she made another discovery. There, hanging just outside the sauna, was a pair of clothes, and she knew instantly whose clothes they were. They belonged to her father, Dennis Antiporek. To everyone's horror, this body, burned beyond recognition, was indeed Dennis. The police would soon be called to the scene. At first, it was presumed that Dennis had died from natural causes, but the police would later make the decision to do a full autopsy. As all this occurred, the family of Dennis hired a lawyer, as they felt the condo owners were responsible in what had happened. The family's lawyer, Joseph Madelon, was later quoted as saying, "We believe that the heart attack was heat-induced. The heating coils on the sauna are required to have a thermostat, and the timer should have worked. Under no circumstances whatsoever should the heat have gotten to a level where he cooked. He was a regular user of the sauna, so his body was used to it. He would go multiple times a week, so we know his body was capable of handling a sauna when it was properly functioning. Our assumption has been that it was a heat-induced stroke, heat-induced heart attack, or heat-induced dehydration." Following a full autopsy, it was found that Dennis had suffered acute, mild cardio infarction due to hyperintensive and atherosclerosis heart disease. It's unclear how long Dennis was alive inside the sauna, but the family has pointed to the fact that the timer seemingly didn't work appropriately, because if it had, it would have stopped the sauna from continuing to heat up. At the same time, no one knows for sure why Dennis didn't simply get up and walk out. Many believe he may have fallen asleep inside, waking only long enough to realize that he had been cooked to his seat. He may have then tried to get up, falling to the ground where he would ultimately perish at some point. Either way, this is an absolutely horrifying fate for anyone to have suffered. As always, my deepest condolences go out to all of Dennis's friends and family. This first story takes us to the quaint town of Cortland, Mississippi. Cortland is a town in Panola County and is located around 145 miles or 233 kilometers north of Jackson, the capital of Mississippi. Cortland is a very blue-collar farming town. The around 500 or so residents attend church every Sunday, and for many, football is a way of life. In fact, numerous kids in Cortland have played their way into the highest mountain of the sport, the NFL. 19-year-old Jessica Chambers was a resident of Cortland. Growing up, Jessica was described as being bubbly, friendly, and full of life. In a small town like Cortland, everyone knows everyone, and Jessica had numerous friends. By the time she hit high school, her popularity with the boys in town only grew. Jessica was a solid student in school, and she loved playing softball growing up. As she hit 6th grade, her attention would shift from softball to cheerleading. She would try out and eventually make the cheerleading squad, and Jessica never looked back. To give some more detail into this aspect of her life, Jessica was very small and petite, so she ended up becoming a flyer for her cheerleading squad. If you're unaware, a flyer is basically, well, what it sounds like. She was one of the girls that would be thrown into the air during routines. Jessica loved everything about cheerleading, and her passion for it continued all the way to graduation. Jessica would eventually graduate high school with nothing but A's and B's. She had always been a very good student. Following her graduation, she would continue to live at home. After turning 19, Jessica would secure a job selling clothes at a goodies department store that was located in nearby Batesville. But Jessica's life wasn't as perfect as it sounds. Following high school, Jessica began hanging out with the wrong people. She began smoking rather frequently, and this led her to befriend some locals in the area that were known for dealing. One of Jessica's best friends would later comment that Jessica had begun selling on a daily basis as well. During this time, Jessica's boyfriend, former high school football player Travis Sanford, was sent to jail on charges of burglary, further showing that Jessica was tangled up with some questionable people at best. That now brings us to December 2nd, 2014. Jessica Chambers was hanging out with 27-year-old Quentin Tellis at the time. From reports, the pair had not known each other for very long. On December 2nd, Jessica would end up going to the emergency room. It's reported that she received some kind of medication. Exactly what that medication was has been speculated on. Many believe she may have been given some kind of opiate. Either way, Quentin would accompany Jessica to the ER. On December 3rd, 2014, Quentin Tellis would text Jessica, "I'm horny." From all reports, this is the first time Quentin makes an effort to get Jessica to sleep with him. Jessica responds with, "Oh Lord, clearly trying to avoid the conversation altogether. On December 4th, the messages between the pair continue, with Quentin once again propositioning Jessica to sleep with him. She continues to avoid giving an answer, once again responding with an "Oh Lord" text. On December 5th, Jessica texts Quentin asking him for some money to get something to eat. Quentin once again propositions her, but Jessica states that she only needs like $6. Security camera footage captures Quentin walking to the M&M gas station and towards Jessica's car, shortly after Quentin is seen walking back to his house. That now brings us to December 6th of 2014. At around 10 a.m., Jessica calls Quentin Tellis and the pair speak for a little over a minute. At 10:08 a.m., Jessica is seen at the M&M gas station where she makes a purchase. At 10:09 a.m., Jessica texts Quentin and states, "I'm ready." Jessica soon leaves the gas station and pulls into Quentin's driveway. She picks Quentin up and the pair begin driving around Cortland. Jessica would drop Quentin back off at his house less than an hour later before heading home. At 5:29 p.m. that afternoon, Quentin texts Jessica and says, "I need you." She asks him what he needs, and he tells her, "Some lovin'." Jessica is quick to respond with another "Oh Lord" before telling Quentin that she can't. During this afternoon time frame, Quentin's girlfriend from Louisiana is actively trying to get a hold of Quentin, looking to come visit him. At around 6 p.m. that evening, Jessica and Quentin are once again together. Jessica picks him up and the pair travel to Taco Bell in Batesville. At around 6:30 p.m., Jessica and Quentin arrive back in Cortland. According to Quentin, Jessica sleeps with him in an area behind his house. Whether this is true or not is not clear. At 6:48 p.m., Jessica calls and speaks with her mother for a little over a minute. Jessica is still with Quentin at this point. Now, this next hour is where things go off the rails. At around 7:30 p.m., cell phone data shows that Jessica and her car have now traveled west towards Heron Road. At 7:42 p.m., Quentin calls Jessica and leaves her an odd voicemail and a text. The text states, "Bae, my friend is coming over tonight. I'll call you tomorrow. Good night, sweet dreams." Now, what exactly happens next is not completely certain. The only people who truly know are Jessica Chambers and potentially Quentin Tellis. But according to law enforcement, this is their theory. While Jessica and Quentin sat in her car in his driveway, it's believed that Quentin made another attempt at having intimate relations with Jessica. Up to this point, it's believed, based on texts and evidence gathered, that Jessica once again refused Quentin's advances. From there, police believe Quentin got extremely angry. In his anger, it's believed that he placed his hands around Jessica's neck and began squeezing until she lost consciousness. It's at this point that Quentin realizes what he has done and quickly begins to think on how he can dispose of the body. He hops into the driver's seat of Jessica's car and then proceeds to travel down towards Heron Road. He would leave the vehicle there, and on foot he would travel to his sister's house, which wasn't far from that area. It's believed that Quentin then dropped or threw Jessica's keys while making that walk. They would later be recovered by the police department. Quentin would arrive at his sister's house, where he would borrow her vehicle and drive it back to his house. At his house, he would grab a can of gasoline that he had stored. He would load the gas into his sister's vehicle and proceed back to Jessica's car. Using the gasoline, Quentin would douse Jessica's car and Jessica herself in the liquid before setting the entire vehicle ablaze with Jessica inside. Quentin would leave the scene before placing the bizarre voicemail and text to Jessica at 7:42. It's believed that this voicemail and text were both done in order to make it seem like he had canceled all plans with Jessica that evening. From there, he drove to a store in Batesville, in turn creating an alibi for his whereabouts. Whether this is spot on or not, what we know for fact is that Jessica Chambers was doused with gasoline and set on fire within her vehicle. At 8:07 p.m. that night, a passerby would see the car engulfed in flames. They would call it in to 911 and firefighters would arrive on scene at around 8:09 p.m.
When I arrived, I pulled around them and pulled on up to where the car was on fire. And
what did you see?
I saw Jessica standing in the road, and then, of course, I seen the car on fire out of the corner of my eye, and I immediately stepped out of the truck and raised the compartment, got a blanket out, and went to Jessica's aid.
Let me ask you about it. Did you know Jessica Chambers?
I knew her. We weren't, friends or anything, but I knew her.
When you first arrived on the scene, did you recognize this person?
No, sir, I did not.
What was this person wearing?
When I seen her, she had nothing on but her pants.
And what did you tell me you did? You got a blanket?
I got out and I got a blanket, and she had her arms out, was coming towards me, saying, "Help me, help me, help me."
Nicole, I want you to describe for this jury what did she look like? What was the condition of Jessica Chambers?
Her hair was fried out like she'd stuck in the light socket. And she had black all over her face. Her body was severely burned. And just all the way down her body was very badly burned. And like I said, and I wrapped the blanket around her to conceal her. And I always knew that learned that burn victims would be cold, and so that's why I placed a blanket around her, and we proceeded to walk up the road. I was trying to get her to the front of the engine 81 to where the headlights were, where it'd be more light, or could access her a little more, see a little better. We made it to the back of engine 81, and she couldn't go anymore. And I proceeded to lay her down on the ground. She reached out for my hand. I held on to her hand, and I talked to her, and I asked her name. She said, "What come out?" Like I said, her mouth, inside her mouth was just charred black, and could not understand her very well at all.
Were you able to get a name?
When I asked her name, she said Jessica Chambers. And like I said, she was not recognizable to me. I know what Jessica Chambers looked like. Did not look like Jessica Chambers at the time.
As heard in the testimony, Jessica Chambers was still alive, but she had been badly burned. As a matter of fact, over 98% of her body had been burned horribly, to the point where no one at the scene recognized her. Jessica would be rushed to a hospital in Memphis, where family soon gathered around her. Hospital staff would do all they could for the young woman. Jessica's mom sat by her side with her daughter's hand in hers. She would eventually tell Jessica that it was okay to go on, and within mere moments later, Jessica Chambers passed on at only 19 years of age. It was later discovered that not only had she been doused in gasoline, but gasoline had been found up her nose and down her throat. The absolutely horrific pain that she went through is something that sits with me. Such a young person with so much life left ahead of them, to have her life cut short in such a horrific manner, it's just not right. At the scene, firefighters would later state that when they asked who did this to her, Jessica responded with what sounded like the name Eric or Derek. This has led to a lot of speculation and theories, as Quentin's name shares little similarity. The police would continue their investigation, and during this time, Quentin would move to Louisiana. What's crazy is that another woman would be found dead, with Quentin Tellis being the prime suspect. Quentin would eventually be charged in the Jessica Chambers murder, as well as the stabbing death of foreign exchange student Meng Chang-so. Quentin was found to be in possession of Meng Chang's credit card following her death. He would be convicted and sentenced to 10 years in prison for the stolen card. While in prison, Quentin was formally charged in the Jessica Chambers case, and he would go before a judge for the first time in 2017. The trial would end with a hung jury, and in 2018 he would be tried a second time, but the result was the same, with another hung jury. Following the second trial, Quentin would be brought back to Louisiana and face charges in the Meng Chang-so case. As of now, Quentin has not been found guilty in either case. Jessica's murder investigation is still ongoing, and hopefully, one day, justice can be served to whomever committed this horrifying crime. My deepest condolences go out to all of Jessica Chambers' family and friends. No one deserves to have their life cut short the way hers was. Mary Reeser was born in Columbia, Pennsylvania. There's not a ton known about her life and upbringing, but Mary would eventually go on to marry a man named Richard Reeser. Mary and Richard would have children together, but sadly, only one would survive to see adulthood. As Mary and Richard grew old together, Richard would pass on first. It was at this point that Mary would make the decision to move to St. Petersburg, Florida. Mary was 67 years old at the time. To give a little more context, St. Petersburg is located on the Pinellas Peninsula between Tampa Bay and the Gulf of Mexico. It is connected to mainland Florida to the north. St. Petersburg is a beautiful place to live, averaging 361 days of sunshine every year. For Mary, this was the perfect place to spend her later years. Her son lived and worked in the area. He was a physician just like his father before him. Mary would settle into a relatively new and furnished apartment in St. Pete's. The apartment had all the amenities one could need, and it was a quiet place to live. With the apartment still being new, Mary and her landlord were the only two people living in the entire building. With that little bit of backstory out of the way, we will now jump ahead to July 2nd of 1951. At around 5 a.m., Mary's landlord, Pansy, awoke to the sound of a thud. Pansy described it as sounding like a door being thrown shut. She would soon rise out of bed and make the walk to her front door. She ventured outside, but saw nothing out of the ordinary. Pansy would begin making her way back into her apartment before she thought she got a whiff of smoke. This wasn't completely unusual for Pansy, as she had an electric pump in her garage that sometimes had issues. She would head into the garage to check on the pump. She saw nothing wrong, but still proceeded to shut it off. She would then head back to bed for about an hour, waking back up around 6 a.m. Pansy would venture again to her front door, this time collecting her newspaper. Being that Pansy and Mary were the only ones that lived in the apartments, they had gotten to know each other quite well. Mary was usually always up early listening to her radio, and Pansy thought it was odd this morning that she didn't hear the radio playing. A couple hours would pass before a telegram arrived from Mary. The man spoke with Pansy briefly, asking which apartment Mary lived in. Pansy informed the man that she would soon bring it to Mary herself. With the telegram in hand, Pansy soon made the walk to Mary's apartment. Pansy reached down to grab the screen door handle for Mary's apartment and immediately noticed it to be hot to the touch. Pansy found this to be very troubling. She would immediately begin looking for someone to alert. Across the street, she found some people that were working on painting a building, and she asked them to check on Mary. While the men proceeded to Mary's apartment, Pansy called the fire department. The men would enter the apartment and begin looking for Mary. There was a lot of smoke within the apartment, making it difficult to locate where Mary was. With all the smoke, you would think there would be a lot of fire, but there simply wasn't. It wasn't until the men began heading back out of the apartment that they would find what they presumed to be Mary. All that appeared to be left of her was a small segment of her leg and a black slipper. The fire department arrived shortly after. They too noticed the apartment was full of smoke, and they soon opened a bunch of windows in order to clear it out. A hand pump would be brought in to put out the smoking heap on the floor of the apartment. It was at this point that the fire chief discovered what looked like the remains of a person. So what happened to Mary? Well, the scene was baffling to say the least. Mary had seemingly burned alive. She was reduced almost completely to ash. All that was left of her was part of her left foot and the slipper that was on it, her backbone, and her skull. The scene baffled experts right from the get-go, and the newspapers soon took a hold of Mary's story, referring to her as the Cinder Lady. A lot of speculation would begin, and people started to wonder if Mary was a case of spontaneous human combustion. For those that aren't aware, spontaneous human combustion is the pseudo-scientific concept of the spontaneous combustion of a living or recently deceased human body without any apparent external sources of ignition. Many of those involved in the case simply couldn't comprehend how Mary had burned so completely, yet the damage to her apartment was seemingly so minimal. At the crime scene, firefighters concluded that Mary's body was found hot enough to destroy almost all of her body and the chair that she was sitting in, but directly behind her chair was a wall, and the paint was neither cracked or burned at all. Light switches in the apartment melted, but some outlets that were located only a few feet lower to the ground were found to be completely untouched. Even the living room rug was found to have been burned, but only underneath where the chair was sitting. Firefighters found some bed sheets a few feet away, and they showed no signs of smoke damage. In fact, they weren't dirty at all. They were as clean as when Mary set them there. So much of the scene was baffling. How did Mary burn? Why didn't she call out for help or make an attempt to get help? How had she just sat there, willingly burning alive? And once again, how was she burnt to such an extreme while the rest of the apartment remained mostly untouched in a lot of ways? The investigation would soon be turned over to the FBI. Detectives couldn't understand what went on with this case, and evidence was sent directly to the FBI for help in understanding what happened to Mary. J. Edgar Hoover himself would assist in the investigation, and on July 31st of 1951, the FBI released their report. In the report, the FBI found 0 accelerants. Now, there was a greasy residue found on some parts of the crime scene, and this greasy substance was analyzed and was found to be nothing more than human body fat. There was also a piece of metal found near what was left of Mary's body. It's believed that this metal was that of a cigarette lighter. On the night of July 1st, 1951, it's believed that Mary took a few Seconal tablets before sitting in her favorite chair. Now, Seconal is a drug that is classified as a barbiturate. Barbiturates are central nervous system depressant drugs. Seconal itself was once prescribed for the treatment of insomnia and as a pre-anesthetic before surgery. However, it is no longer available within the United States. After Mary took the pills and sat in her chair, she would eventually light up a cigarette. It's believed that she fell asleep with the cigarette lit, which caused her to burn up over time. With there being very little widespread fire damage, it's believed that the fire smoldered rather than straight up burned. Now, this theory explains a lot, but still leaves a lot of questions. The most common theory discussed in cases like Mary's is the wick effect. The wick effect explains how a human body can burn extensively in a fire, where the victim's clothing acts like a wick, absorbing melted body fat and sustaining a localized flame, essentially acting like a candle, allowing the body to burn for a prolonged period, even with a relatively small ignition source. This theory is often used when people discuss cases involving spontaneous human combustion. At the end of the day, the case of Mary Reeser is a baffling one. My biggest question at the end of it all is, can someone be so asleep that they never wake up while slowly burning alive? I have a hard time coming to terms with that. Then again, could Mary have died in her sleep before the cigarette slowly burned her and the chair into nothing but ash? I guess it's possible. In the end, Mary's case is a horrifying one, just as much as it is baffling. As always, my deepest condolences go out to all of Mary's family and friends. Dr. Hitoshi Christopher Nikaidoh was born on April 27, 1968, in Japan. As a child, Hitoshi and his family made the decision to move to the United States. Growing up, Hitoshi had a passion to one day become a doctor. He would begin his journey by attending and then graduating from the University of Texas Houston Medical School in 2003. Following his graduation, Hitoshi would secure a residency at Christos St. Joseph Hospital, located at 1401 St. Joseph Parkway, Houston, Texas. With that little bit of backstory out of the way, we will now head to August 16th, 2003, at around 9:30 a.m. 46-year-old physician's assistant Karen Stenio would make her way down the hallway of the hospital's second floor. She would approach a set of elevators, pressing the call button, and waiting for it to arrive and open up. A few moments would pass, and Karen was boarding the elevator. Inside, she reached down and pressed the button that would send her to the 6th floor. As this was going on, Dr. Hitoshi was also on his way to board the elevator. As he approached the open door, he would throw both of his hands up and state, "Finally, they're working again." As he reached the elevator's entrance, the doors began to slowly close. As most people would, Dr. Hitoshi expected the doors to open back up immediately. But that's just not what happened. Within the blink of an eye, the doors closed in on Dr. Hitoshi. He was soon trapped with part of his body, more so his head, inside the elevator, while the rest of his body was panicking outside of it. In shock, Dr. Hitoshi began yelling, as Karen Stenio looked on in horror from inside the elevator. Within a couple seconds, the elevator would begin moving, making its way up towards the 6th floor. Before Karen had any time to react, it was too late. Dr. Hitoshi let out one final cry for help as the elevator drove Hitoshi into the floor above. Karen would jump back in absolute horror as blood sprayed into the elevator. A cracking sound could be heard, followed by a thump as part of Dr. Hitoshi's head hit the floor of the elevator in front of Karen. The elevator would come to a stop as the rest of Dr. Hitoshi's body plummeted down the elevator shaft, landing in a crumpled mess of blood and bone below. The entire ordeal was like something out of a Final Destination film. Karen stared on in horror, still unable to process what she just witnessed. It would take the fire department over an hour before they were finally able to rescue Karen from within the elevator. As for Hitoshi, nothing could be done. He was pronounced deceased at the scene. The investigation was soon underway to determine what had happened. First was the autopsy. Results would show numerous injuries to Dr. Hitoshi Nikaidoh's body. He had broken ribs, spinal injuries, cuts all over, and a portion of his head had snapped off at the upper jaw. An absolutely horrible way to go. With the autopsy now complete, investigators continued their work looking at the elevator. It was first discovered that the elevator had been closed periodically for a few weeks prior to the incident. The Delaware-based Cone Elevators were in charge of repairs and maintenance and had recently done work in that elevator. As investigators looked over the elevator piece by piece, they would soon discover that one particular wire had been placed on the wrong controller stud. This simple miswiring caused a bypass in the elevator's safety systems, the safety systems that would have kept the elevator from closing in on Dr. Nikaidoh. Following a thorough investigation, the police would release their findings to the public, and soon after, the family of Nikaidoh would file a lawsuit against Cone Elevators. Cone would end up taking full responsibility for their mistake. They would end up paying out an undisclosed settlement to the family of Dr. Hitoshi Nikaidoh. As for Karen, she would suffer from post-traumatic stress disorder following the incident. In the end, she also ended up with an undisclosed settlement. After all said and done, a promising young doctor lost his life in such a meaningless and tragic manner. I want to send my deepest condolences to all the friends and family of Dr. Hitoshi Nikaidoh, and I also want to send my deepest sympathies to Karen Stenio. I truly hope that she has found peace after witnessing such a horrible fate. Larry Ellie Murillo-Moncada was born August 22, 1984, to parents Victor and Ana. The family originated from Honduras, but early on in Larry's childhood, the family made the move to the United States. They moved to Council Bluffs, Iowa. Council Bluffs is located on the east bank of the Missouri River, just across from Omaha, Nebraska. It is Iowa's 10th most populous city, with a population of around 62,799 residents. There's not a ton of information about Larry's childhood, but it's said that he struggled with his mental health growing up. which led Larry to being prescribed antidepressants. The medications would help Larry to an extent, but he didn't always like how he felt on the medicine, as side effects for drugs can cause just as much of a disturbance in one's life. Now, let's jump ahead to November of 2009. It was Thanksgiving, and 25-year-old Larry was working a shift at the No Frills supermarket, which was located less than a mile or 1.6 kilometers from his home, where he still lived with his parents. After Larry's shift ended, he would head home, where his mother noticed he seemed a bit disoriented. Larry's mother asked if he was doing okay, and Larry told her he was fine, but a mother knows best, and Larry's mother was fearing the worst. She was concerned that Larry had stopped taking his medication again. November 28, 2009. A blizzard would hit Council Bluffs, Iowa. It was rough going outside, and Larry and his family stayed home while the snow continued to come down. As the day continued on, Larry's mother became increasingly concerned about her son. It appeared he was suffering some hallucinations, making his behavior erratic. Larry's mother tried to speak to him, but he wasn't making any sense. Larry was hearing voices, and they were telling him to eat sugar. Larry believed that his heart was beating far too hard, and the voices had convinced him that eating sugar would stop it from doing so. At 6:15 p.m. that evening, Larry got into an argument with both his parents. Following this fight, Larry ran from his house, barefoot, down the road and into the blizzard. His parents called after him, but Larry was determined to get away. With Larry gone, his mother's concern had now hit a fever pitch as Larry was barefoot, wearing only a navy blue hoodie and light blue pants, and he did not take his keys or his car. Now, this wasn't the first time Larry had left, so his parents were hopeful he would come home within a few hours. And that night, his parents would wait up for him, but Larry did not come home. The following morning, his family would head out looking for him, but they were unable to find any evidence of where he could have gone. The police would soon be called, and Larry was reported missing. Investigators would begin their search, but no sign of Larry was found. It was like he ran out that door and vanished into thin air. Pretty soon, days would turn to weeks, weeks to months, and months to years. Every year that passed by, Larry's mother hoped for a safe return. It would sadly take a full decade before the family finally got some answers as to what happened to their child. January 24th, 2019. Contractors were sent into the No Frills grocery store that Larry used to work at. Their job was to remove some old freezer units left within the store. See, this particular store location had closed down back in 2016. From 2016 to 2019, the store had been left all but vacant, with some random pieces of equipment being all that was left behind by the grocery store chain. As contractors worked inside, they approached one of the tall freezers and began pulling it away from the wall. As they did, one of the workers would soon yell "stop," as a grisly discovery was made. There, behind the freezer, was a mummified human body. No one on site could believe what they had just found. Soon, police were called to the scene, and officers had an idea of who this could be. It would end up taking 6 months, but in July of 2009, investigators released their findings. The body they had discovered was indeed Larry Murillo-Moncada. Larry had finally been found after all these years, and what's more bizarre is that he was so close to home all this time. But how did he end up behind the freezer? And how had he gone so long back there without discovery? Following the autopsy, police determined there was no sign of foul play. This had simply been a sad and tragic accident. In the end, investigators believed that Larry left his home on foot and in the snow. He then traveled to the only other place he was comfortable and familiar with, his workplace. Once inside the grocery store, they believe that he climbed on top of the refrigerator units before he accidentally fell sideways into an 18-inch or 46-centimeter gap that was located between the wall and the back of the coolers. After he fell in, he ultimately became trapped at the bottom of the 12-foot-high or 3.7-meter drop. Now, the units were very noisy and they ran all the time, so detectives believe this is why no one heard Larry cry out for help. Following the discovery of Larry, some former employees came forward to speak on why Larry climbed up there. From what they have stated, employees used to take unofficial breaks by climbing on top of the coolers. This space on top was mostly used for storage, and an employee could hide out up there for a bit and relax. Also, the cooler itself was located in a back room of the store and was not in public view, which would probably be why he was never discovered. After some further research into the case, I did find some alarming comments that were left by people who used to shop at this no-frills grocery store. It turns out, if someone had investigated a little bit further, perhaps Larry could have been recovered sooner, as shoppers reported that the store used to have an awful smell back near the cooler area. This smell was so bad that a lot of shoppers refused to go back to the store, while other shoppers reported the smell, but for some reason, no one took the time or effort to find the source. In the end, Larry died cold and alone, trapped behind a cooler and pinned between it and a wall, just mere feet away from workers and guests. It's horrifying to think about, and all I can do is hope that Larry went quickly. The idea of him being trapped for days on end just sends further shivers down my spine. No one should ever have to suffer such a horrible fate. I want to send my sincerest condolences to all of Larry's friends and family. Now, this story goes to show that even the most boring and mundane tasks we do every day can end up being a danger to our very existence. Brian Depledge was a 38-year-old father of 2 from England. It was September of 2011, and Brian was at home by himself working on some household chores. He would soon hear the washing machine beep, signaling that the load he threw in to wash was now done. He would head to the washing machine and load up the clothes, bringing them over to the clothes horse so he can hang them up to dry. If you're uncertain what a clothes horse is a portable frame, usually made of wood, metal, or plastic, upon which wet laundry is hung to dry by evaporation. It's a simple and inexpensive way to dry one's clothing. As Brian began placing wet articles of clothing on the rack, he would take a step and end up tripping over a stool he had placed nearby. This caused Brian to lose his balance, and as he did, he fell backwards, slamming into the clothes horse. As Brian tried to catch his bearings, he soon realized he was in a bizarre situation. He had landed just right and had gotten himself trapped within the rack. Brian would struggle to get free. He then placed his right arm through one of the segments, but by pushing down on the bars, it only tightened the grip that the device had on him, making it harder and harder to breathe as each second passed by. Not being able to breathe just caused Brian to panic more and more, and as he thrashed around, the device continued to constrict on his neck and chest. Within moments, Brian would lose consciousness. When he was finally discovered later that day, it was too late. Emergency personnel were called to Brian's house, and he was pronounced dead at the scene. An autopsy would later confirm that he had died due to suffocation, and his death was listed as being accidental. Brian left behind an 18-year-old daughter and an 11-year-old son. His death was a freak, tragic accident, and one that could happen to anyone listening to this video. See, we all go about our daily lives doing the same things day in and day out, and sometimes we don't recognize the danger before it's too late. I hope by sharing Brian's story that maybe we can prevent something similar happening to someone else. In the end, my deepest condolences go out to all of Brian's family and friends. Mark Gleeson was a 26-year-old man from Headley Down, Hampshire. Headley Down is a village within the civil parish of Headley in the East Hampshire district of Hampshire, England. It is 36 miles or 58 kilometers southwest of London and 1 mile or 1.6 kilometers east of Headley Village Centre. Earlier on in Mark's life, he had suffered some sort of a road accident which left him with serious sinus problems. Those problems led him to develop a serious snoring issue, one that his family would poke fun at consistently. When Mark eventually formed a relationship with Tracy Lambert, the issue of his snoring became something he wanted to actively correct. He wanted to be able to stay the night at his girlfriend's and sleep next to her without pushing her to relocate to the couch. Mark decided it was finally time to do something. So he made an appointment and went to see his doctor to find out what options he had for fixing his predicament. Sadly, this appointment didn't end the way he wanted it to. After speaking to his doctor, it was revealed to him that his current situation had no options to correct his problem. Later that evening, Mark traveled to Tracy's place for the night. He was a bit bummed out about everything, so he decided to indulge in some wine. Afterwards, the pair prepared for bed, and Mark took a sleeping pill, hoping it may help with his snoring as well. It was around this point that Mark and Tracy discussed an idea they had. What if they took a couple of tampons and plugged Mark's nose? Could this solve the issue with Mark's snoring? Mark decided it was worth a shot, and soon fell asleep with the tampons plugging up his nose. From all reports, it doesn't appear Mark snored that night. But as Tracy arose the next morning, she was greeted by a horrible scene. She went to check on Mark and wake him up, but he was cold to the touch. She started to freak out, and that's when she checked and realized he wasn't breathing. Emergency personnel would rush to the scene, but it was far too late. Mark had perished. An autopsy would be performed, and it was found that Mark had died due to asphyxiation, due to a combination of the alcohol, sleeping pills, and the obstruction to both of his nasal cavities. In the end, Mark's death is a tragic and senseless one, and I want to send my deepest condolences to all of his family and friends. It was July 21st, 2022, in the village of Karmeh Yosef, Israel. Karmeh Yosef is a community settlement in the Judean foothills in central Israel. It is located around 24 miles or 38.6 kilometers west of Jerusalem and has a population of around 1,700 residents. It was a beautiful, sunny day, and 32-year-old Klil Kimhi was attending a private work event that was being held at a beautiful villa that the company had rented out for employees. All those in attendance were enjoying themselves, kicking back and relaxing, enjoying drinks, food, and swimming within the villa's stunning pool. As the afternoon continued on, Klil decided to jump in the pool to cool off. In the pool, he enjoyed a drink and sparked up a conversation with some fellow employees that he knew. Everything was going about as normal and as planned as possible, when out of nowhere, the water level within the pool began to recede. It all happened so fast. Most people didn't have even a moment's notice to react. The water level continued to disappear at an alarming rate as a vortex within the pool formed. This vortex didn't discriminate. As it began consuming the water in the pool, the numerous flotation devices scattered about, and the people who happened to be enjoying a swim. Within seconds, the pool was empty, and a large hole could be seen. A bunch of patrons managed to escape, but 2 men were pulled into that hole. One man managed to climb his way back out, and miraculously, he had only suffered minor injuries. But Klil was not so lucky. He had been sucked deep into the earth below the pool. Onlookers would attempt to rescue Klil, but locating him seemed next to impossible. Soon, emergency services arrived on scene. It would take them hours of work, but eventually they were able to locate the body of Klil Kimhi. He had been consumed by a giant sinkhole that had taken him 43 feet deep into the earth below. For those that don't know, a sinkhole is a depression or hole in the ground caused by some form of collapse of the surface layer. Officials during the investigation discovered that the villa's owner had not obtained proper permits to build the pool. The owners would end up facing charges of negligent homicide, operating a business without a license, and money laundering. The infrastructure around this home had issues that would have resulted in the denial of a permit to build that pool, but the owners had gone ahead and built one anyways. Having this pool, in turn, increased the value of the home and made it so that they could rent it out for parties and events. The entire thing was profit-driven, and it resulted in a man losing his life in an absolutely horrifying manner. My condolences go out to all of Klil Kimhi's family and friends. Christopher Gerard Powell was born in 1984 to parents Debbie and Jerry Powell. Chris would grow up in a large family, having 4 brothers, Michael, Daniel, Jeremy, and Andrew. The family were all very close growing up in Ottawa, Ontario, Canada. Now, there's not a ton known about Christopher's youth. We know that he went to high school at the J.S. Woodworth Secondary School, which was a high school in the Borden Farm neighborhood of Ottawa, Ontario, Canada. After graduating, Christopher would go on to attend Carleton University. Carleton is an English language public research university located in Ottawa, Ontario, Canada. Christopher was big into sports throughout his entire life, but his truest love was ultimate frisbee. Christopher absolutely loved everything there is to the game of ultimate frisbee. At Carleton University, he continued this passion, representing and playing for the university's team. That now takes us to October 15th of 2005. Christopher and his teammates traveled to Montreal to play in the Canadian University Ultimate Frisbee Championship. Now, Montreal is located around 200 kilometers or 124 miles east of Carleton University. After making the trip there, the boys settled in, and on the night of October 15th, Christopher and his teammates would head out to take in some of the nightlife in the area. That evening, the group of friends would hit Club Le Boom, which is located at 1254 Stanley Street in Montreal. From my research, I didn't find a lot of positive reviews about this club or the area. Now, take that as you will, it's 2025 now, and Christopher went there back in 2005. Over the course of 20 years, a lot can certainly change. After enjoying a night out drinking, Christopher would leave Club Le Boom at around 1 a.m. in the morning. From there, not a lot else is known in Christopher's case. For the sake of sharing his story, we are going to go over what could have happened based on the 2 most likely of scenarios. Scenario 1, Christopher would leave the bar at 1 a.m. and begin walking in the direction of where he and his teammates were staying. At some point during his walk, Christopher would end up inside a parking garage. Now, what was he doing in there? I can't be certain. There's little to no information given by the police. But I did see one report that Christopher may have been looking for a discreet place to relieve his very full bladder. Whatever the case was, Christopher was presumed to be intoxicated to some degree. He would soon end up in the direction of an elevator that was no longer in use. Whether it was his impaired state or simply just a tragic accident, Christopher would fall into the open elevator shaft. Within a few moments, his body would crash to the ground below. It's not known if Christopher died instantly or if it was prolonged, but the following morning, a parking garage attendant would make the grisly discovery. Police and EMS were called to the scene, but sadly, Chris had already passed on. Following Christopher's death, police initially stated that they didn't believe foul play was involved, but around a month after his death, the police seemed to change their mind on this. Police would speak to the press and state that indeed there was some suspicion in regards to his death. Investigators in Montreal would ask the public for help, hoping to hear from anyone who saw Christopher Powell that night. Now, based on the cops' investigation, I believe scenario number 2 goes a bit differently. We don't know anything for certain, but if there was foul play, then we have to presume that someone else came upon Christopher that night. Was it someone he knew? Was it a friend? Or a complete stranger? Did they force him into the parking garage? Were they looking to rob him? In the end, Christopher's cause of death was determined to be from the fall, so he either fell in because of a tragic accident, or he fell in because someone pushed, threw, or forced him to jump down that escalator shaft. This October will be 20 years since the death of Christopher Powell. In sharing his story, I hope to bring some more awareness to his case, as there's not much out there about him. If you or anyone you know has any information about the death of Christopher Powell, then please reach out to the Montreal Police Department. As always, my deepest condolences go out to all of the friends and family members of Christopher Gerard Powell. This next story involves 2 men, Steve Wright, a 20-year-old man from Guerneville, California, and Mark Kraynak, a 23-year-old man from Uniontown, Pennsylvania. In 2005, Mark Kraynak was getting ready to go back to Penn State to complete his sophomore year of college, studying business management. In 2003, Mark served in the U.S. Army 82nd Airborne Division in Baghdad, Iraq. During his service, he received a shrapnel wound from an IED. He was awarded a Purple Heart following this incident. While stationed at Fort Bragg, North Carolina, Mark found a connection within the FCF agency out of Atlanta. The FCF agency, otherwise known as the French Connection Française Agency, provides modeling for adult entertainment. The agency has offices in Toronto, Atlanta, and Santa Rosa, California. In my research, I sadly wasn't able to find a lot of information about Steve Wright. What we do know is that he, like Mark, joined up with the FCF agency. Which now takes us to August of 2005. Both men traveled to Canada with their employer to perform at Remington's, which is located in Toronto. Mark would perform under the name Nick, and Steve performed under the name Trevor. On August 21st, 2005, Mark and Steve spent the day traveling around and seeing Montreal's tourist sites. They did so with Steven Gerard and Derek Manzi. Gerard is the CEO of French Connection Française, the modeling company that the men were working for. Derek Manzi was a fellow friend and male stripper. As the day turned to night, the group went out to party at the Vatican. The Vatican is a club located in downtown Montreal. One thing of note that took place at the Vatican was the large tip that Mark left a waitress of $200. This may not seem important now, but it will be later on in the story. At some point in the night, the men got separated from their employer. They would proceed to call him around 3 a.m. as they got into a cab and instructed the driver to bring them to the Red Light. The Red Light is an after-hours rave club located around 30 minutes away in the city of Laval. At around 3:32 a.m., the men would pull up to the club, but they simply never made it inside. Steven Gerard, the company's CEO, called their cell phones numerous times in the early morning hours, but he could never manage to reach the pair. Gerard was quoted as saying, "They were the most reliable guys, always prompt, always polite, never late for a shoot. It was unsettling that they weren't contacting me." The next day would come and go, then another, and the men were seemingly nowhere to be found. It was as if they had vanished without a trace. The men were eventually reported missing, but it didn't seem like the police were all too invested right off the bat. But on day 10, everything would change, as the police would be forced into truly looking into what had happened. The Laval Quarry was located around 100 or so meters away from the Red Light Club. Inside the quarry, a horrifying discovery was made, as both Steve and Mark's badly damaged and decomposing bodies were found. The discovery, in a lot of ways, forced the police to start really looking into what had happened. Their bodies were recovered and autopsies would be done. In the end, the autopsy showed no signs of foul play. Soon, the police would start canvassing the area where the men were supposed to have been dropped off, and during this, they managed to locate surveillance video. This video would connect the dots in certain aspects of the story. At around 3:32 a.m., the men are dropped off at the Red Light Club. From there, they are seen running on camera in the direction of the quarry. The presumed taxi they had been riding in can then be seen following behind the men. A few moments later, the taxi is then seen coming back into frame as it then proceeds to leave the area. From the evidence, it looks like, for one reason or another, the men began running from the taxi. It was dark, and they eventually came upon the fence surrounding the local quarry. From local reports, this fence had not always been very well maintained, and there's a good chance they slipped through a hole within the fence. As the men made their way through the hole, they continued running through about 20 feet of bushes before the ground before them simply dropped away into absolute darkness. It's at this point both Mark and Steve began falling over 50 feet down into the unforgiving quarry below. The fall would have been catastrophic to their bodies. It's not clear if the fall killed them both instantly or if either survived for a time afterwards. But by day 10, when their bodies were recovered, it was already far too late. But why were they running? Well, police theorized that the pair were attempting to stiff the cab driver out of his roughly $40 fare. In their efforts to get away from the cabbie, they made their way through the fence and plummeted to their death. Simply a tragic accident. Mark's mother, on the other hand, sees things a little differently. She would end up viewing the security camera footage, and according to her, Steve was running for his life. Police would make an effort to find the cab driver involved in the incident, but from what I've seen, the cab driver was never located. Also, the $200 tip was something I pointed out earlier in the story. This tip makes me pause when it comes to paying the taxicab driver. If the men were so easily throwing money around that night, including a $200 tip, then why would they get cheap on their cab driver? Police did find cash in the men's wallets, and it said that they only had enough money to cover either the taxicab fare or entry into the club. But I've also seen it pointed out that the men had credit and debit cards on them. The biggest question in this entire case is what went on in the taxi right before Steve and Mark fled. Was the taxicab coming after them? Was there someone else there that had threatened their lives? Or was this simply a tragic accident over a $40 taxicab fare? Mark's mother would eventually file a lawsuit against both the quarry and the Montreal Police Department. The outcome of said lawsuits doesn't appear to have been made public, but if anyone has any information about this, I would love if you shared in the comment section below. In the end, we don't have all the puzzle pieces, but what I do know is that 2 young lives ended on that fateful night in August of 2005. They ended in a terrifying and horrible instant as both Mark and Steve plunged to their unknowing deaths below. I want to take a moment to send my deepest condolences to both Mark and Steve's family and friends. Jeffrey Zine was a 37-year-old man from Billings. Billings is a city in southern Montana on the Yellowstone River. It is the most populous city in the state of Montana, with a population of around 117,000 residents. Jeffrey was a husband and father of a 2-year-old boy. Jeffrey and his wife worked together running Montana Air Cartage. Montana Air Cartage was founded in 1989. The company is family-owned, operated, and headquartered in Billings, Montana. The company provides pickup and delivery services statewide, as well as into northern Wyoming, southern Idaho, and eastern Washington state. Jeffrey was described by those that he knew and those that worked for him as a good, caring man. He was known to always put others first, and he was a hard worker. On Monday, March 10th, 2025, Jeffrey made his way to the Red Lodge Mountain to do some snowboarding. Red Lodge Mountain is an alpine ski area located in south-central Montana along the eastern front of the Beartooth Mountains and west of the town of Red Lodge. Now, it's unclear if Jeffrey made the trip to the mountain alone or not. What we do know is that he was snowboarding alone on March 10th. The day was seemingly going as planned as Jeffrey hit the slopes and enjoyed some fresh powder. Following a run down the mountain, Jeffrey made his way over to the mountain's triple chairlift. The triple chairlift was built in 1983, and it runs just shy of a mile long, or around 1.6 kilometers. Soon, it was Jeffrey's turn as he approached the lift loading area. He would get into place as the lift came up from behind, plopping himself right into the seat and making his way up the mountain. As the lift continued to climb, strong gusts of wind were tearing through the area. Some gusts were reported as being as strong as 50 miles per hour or 80.4 kilometers an hour. Now, with this case being so new and still under investigation, we don't have all the answers as of yet. But at some point on Jeffrey's trip up the mountain, the lift would encounter a mechanical error. Now, for those of you that have never been skiing or snowboarding, I want to give a little insight into how these chairlifts work. I've done a lot of snowboarding over the years myself, and the way the lifts are designed is they come up from behind, and you basically hop into the seat with your board hooked to one foot, and you're taken up. Now, there is a safety bar that you can then pull down in front of you as you make your way up the mountain. Logic tells you that you should use this bar, but I will be honest with everyone, not everyone does. I remember in my youth snowboarding at Jimney Peak in Hancock, Massachusetts. Me and my friends would ride the lift, and I always wanted the bar to come down, but my friends hated using it at all. So, for the sake of Jeffrey's story, we do not know for sure whether or not he had the safety bar down, but I have a feeling he did not. As Jeffrey continued heading up, another gust of wind would hit the lift. Between the wind and some sort of a mechanical issue, this gust would cause Jeffrey to lose his balance. He and his snowboard would fall from the chairlift, plummeting an unspecified distance to the unforgiving ground below. Chairlift operators would be notified, and they immediately shut things down. At the same time, emergency personnel stationed at the mountain would make their way to Jeffrey. He was found to still be alive as he was urgently sent to a hospital in Billings. At the hospital, emergency personnel did all they could for the loving husband and father. Jeffrey would fight for his life for around 24 hours, but sadly, he would end up passing away, just a day after the tragic incident. An investigation would soon be underway to figure out what had happened, and according to the Red Lodge Mountain, the chairlift had been maintained in accordance with safety standards. There's a lot of work that needs to be done in this investigation. With this story being so recent, we just don't have all the answers as of yet. I simply can't imagine how horrifying it must have been for Jeffrey to fall from one of those ski lifts. For me, this was always one of the most terrifying aspects of snowboarding. I had to work really hard over the years to get over my fear of heights. Now, in closing, I just want to end the story now by sending my sincere condolences to all of Jeffrey's family and friends. I also will include a link in the description box below to the GoFundMe that was started for Jeffrey's wife and child, for anyone that would like to contribute. A big thank you to each and every one of you for tuning in to another episode. If you enjoy the content I make here on the channel, then please hit the like and subscribe button. It helps the channel continue to grow, and it's completely free. Also, you can check the description box below and find the link to my merch store and a link to my membership tier for the channel. YouTube ad revenue hasn't been that great lately, and for only $2.99 a month, you can help support my channel further, and you get some cool perks to go along with it. One of those perks is having your name listed here in the end of each of my videos. So thank you to all my Cellar Dweller members. Also, if you'd like to submit any kind of real-life scary story of any kind, please do so using the email linked in the description box below. As always, I do all the research, writing, recording, and editing for the channel myself, so anything that you do to help support the channel is greatly appreciated. And until next time, I will see you all again as we head back into the cellar.